I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. And in this video I would like to talk about the topic of imagination. And really the debate, does imagination differ in artistic expressions versus scientific and mathematical expressions? And my thought is no, they don't. And I say no, they don't because of what I understand, or at least what I conceive about the human imagination and what's really responsible for it in the brain, or just the mechanisms that we readily associate with imagination. So, first and foremost, it seems that when people say that imagination are just the creation activities that happen in art and in science differ, because in art you're trying to create and conceive something, but in science or in mathematics you're trying to discover things. So one is dealing with elements that are arising out of the self, and another is dealing with elements that are objective in reality and drawing them to the self. Roughly, that's what people are saying and why they're differing things. Now, why I say that that's just not true, it's not that binary, simplistic picture, it's rather a false dichotomy, because quite simply, imagination, at least from a neuroscientific standpoint, seems to be intellectual reconfiguration or the restructuring of memory or things that already exist. The combination of intuition, developing a set of expectations over time given observations in one's environment, and conceptual fluidity, which seems to have a very strong relationship with expertise and fluid intelligence. So the bases for what constitutes, or just what it seems to be that people are talking about when they say that somebody has a very strong imagination or is very imaginative, or just that or when one is talking about an imaginative action, it seems to be a composition of these elements within it, at least cognitively so. And it's to say that, one, if the idea about originality, so that artists, they come up with completely original things, I think that anybody knows that a good artist steals things and they transform and change them to such a degree that you can't follow the tracks of what they stole. But things don't spontaneously arise out of anywhere. And even one's local experiences, if one's looking at a mountain and is suddenly inspired to depict sort of the emotional state that they were in, not even the mountain themselves, because that seems where postmodern art goes, and just depict sort of the state of being and what that may play out to be. The imagery, at least according to Jung and many thinkers, is something that is arising from archetypal images within the contents of the psyche. And even you being able to render that thing as a person on a canvas or in a sonnet or whatever, however it is you express that artistic medium, is greatly contextualized and structured by the cultural systems around you. Essentially, you can't express anything. Your mode of expression is greatly determined by the cultural makeup around you. The contents of that painting, though you would think it's solely original, the contents of that sonnet, though you would think it's solely original, or something that arises because of the individual themselves, the individual doesn't even arise because of themselves. The individual rises, and the expression rises out of this interplay between biology and culture as extant. And so it's like nothing is completely original insofar as that you're bringing in any new elements or doing anything other than restructuring or recombining things that already exist. And so I suppose that would seem sort of like a nihilistic quip and saying there's no such thing as originality or the disavowal of it, but I'll give this simple analogy. If one takes flour, eggs, milk, and butter and makes a cake with them, no, the cake is the all the elements that it took to make that cake, they are what they are, but when they're synthesized and combined in a new manner under a certain type of pressure, or at least catalysts for change, they become something totally different, because the cake, just the way the cake is contextually, what its actual just structural makeup is completely different than the butter, the milk, or the eggs by themselves. And that's what I believe in, to some respects, about originality. Though the imagination, particularly we can see this in dreams, or even when somebody daydreams, it's a reconstruction of things that have occurred. It's still something that is portraying what's not there in reality. It's when you take and reconstruct things that are real, doesn't mean you're necessarily getting real things back. You're getting things, if you have just interesting dreams like my own, I see people in my dreams, but they're nothing like people I see in the real world, insofar as that they don't even seem, to some respects, when I analyze them, to be actual representations of people, but representations of other things that I'm not fully aware of myself that I'm seeing. So, moving on to conceptual fluidity. And conceptual fluidity is something interesting. Oh, well, I'll go back and say that it's the process, or at least the biological and neurological processes of what lead. Oh, and it's to say another, excuse me, sorry to cut myself off several times and seem to sort of make my presentation confusing, but it's to say, extending that idea that imagination doesn't differ, it's what one may think, or why this dichotomy may even come to exist. It is even determined by what one thinks about the scientific method, or what it means to be a scientist necessarily. And to say that there's a certain stigma that the process of discovery is completely an analytical one, where one is merely comparing things and computing bits and facts of data. And that's true, but observation and hypotheses generation, and the analyses portion of, and conclusion, I'm going over the scientific method, but there's only one part of the scientific method that is truly analytical, insofar as the experiment itself, and then the computation. Experimentation and computation, very analytical. But then the actual conclusion about what has been computed and what has been experimentally demonstrated is an intuitive associative process. You need intuition. You need your imagination and intuition first and foremost to even look at that observation different from how most people would look at that observation in the environment, or even pay attention to sort of the details that one has to pay attention to come up with anything that's worth hearing or listening to. You're not viewing the world with just a normal lens per se. Your perception is skewed in some manner, in a very abstracting way to some extent. And you take that and you develop a question with it. I mean, why things don't mean a certain thing when they occur, but could potentially mean this thing, is not something that is just evident, or something that one can even arrive at by reading texts or dealing with just procedural forms of knowledge, because science is so concerned about what we don't know. It has to use so much imagination within the process of gathering data and structuring data and interpreting it, that it's to say that there's this dichotomy between the imagination of an artist and the imagination of a scientist. I just don't believe it's true, because the underlying mechanisms and the actual scientific method, just what exists. It seems that people, whether they're doing math, whether they're doing science, whether they're writing a sonnet or poetry, the imagination and the creativity that occurs in these processes are ubiquitous in the same, they're one and the same thing. It seems that the differentiating element is the domain of knowledge itself, and creativity is domain specific. It's why one may even consider that there is a dichotomy between the imagination of an artist and the imagination of a scientist or a mathematician. But it is not true insofar as that what the artist is doing, what the scientists are doing, whether they're aware that they're doing the same things or not, are doing the same things. The brain it's the same. It doesn't. I mean, it might as well be 2 pounds of tofu, but like for all we know, it's the same. Just the processes that occur in one generally occur in the other. And so it's why I make that generality and that connecting point between the two. Now it's to move to conceptual fluidity, in saying that for one to be able to sort of actually change perspective, do a bit of perspective shifting with conceptual models that currently exist within a domain of knowledge, it seems that a person has to have a great deal of expertise, or the help of serendipity, or just random chance. But it seems to actually use imagination insofar as we conceive it to be something that leads to the production of work. One really needs to have this conceptual fluidity, and it only seems that one gets this conceptual fluidity through a great deal of practice and familiarity with the objects already extant within the field. And it's to say, again, that I don't know really why it works this way, and I don't know how this relationship necessarily works, but it seems that the networks of the brain that are responsible for our imagination are the same ones that are responsible for memory retrieval and memory assimilation. It's like when you retrieve a memory, it seems what memory retrieval does is create a point at which the memory can have other elements added to it, enacted on it. That's why memory is a distorted phenomena anyways, and you can't really trust it per se, because there's new associations linked to a previous memory when you recall it. It's why it seems those are the mechanisms for even learning, insofar as being able to construct mental schemas and mental images. You know, it's for us to even be able to learn and move through the environment, we need to be able to do this thing of reconstructing memories and having the ability to extend more associations onto previous memories. And that seems roughly to be the same mechanism that creates imagination. If one even talks about daydreaming, the default mode network is at work even in that process. And it seems that daydreaming, it's just active, it's dreaming as if you were sleeping, but just something that happens in the active state while the current knowledge mode or network is turned on. It just seems that the default mode network is turned on while the other memory-based just memory-based network is on, and these competing networks being on causes the phenomenon of daydreaming. But it's just to say that even the most fantastical elements of the human mind, which I hate to sound reductionistic when I say this, come down to the interplay of the psyche, neurophrenology, just neurophysiology, neurobiology. There's a cellular basis for everything, and there will be at some point a physiological mechanism in understanding all of those things. And well, maybe not, but that's just the championing spirit of science that's coming out in me when I say that. It shows I've been indoctrinated to some extent. But it's to say this, that expertise is something that's general and is required in all fields to be seminal or highly imaginative. You don't get Da Vinci, you don't get Michelangelo, you don't get Raphael without the hours and hours of work and deliberation. It's just in the practice. You don't get it without it. Same can be said for Shakespeare. And it's like you don't even the most imaginative and creative individuals, they're doing a process that is something that all people do to some extent and are capable of doing. Do not let the superficial fields, and so far as saying that just because something has a different appearance, don't mistake it for being something other than it's not. You know, you put a wig on somebody, it doesn't really change who they are, what it is, or what they are. They're simply in a different dress or makeup. But imagination, insofar as its actual mechanism and what it is, seems to be ubiquitous. No matter whether you're talking about an artist or a scientist or a mathematician, they all have the same imagination. They all have the same capacity for imagination. They may be using them differently because of the domain specificity of creativity, but it is imagination nonetheless, and you cannot have sort of the capacity for imagination without intellectual recombination or memory or reconstruction, deconstruction and reconstruction. You can't have it without conceptual fluidity. And finally, I would say you can't seem to have it without constraints or problems per se. For one to be able to see what's not there, it seems that one has to know what's already there to some extent and have a very good understanding of what's already there. And it's through this understanding of what's already there, therefore the interplay between these elements that make this contradiction or make this angst or depression or I am blanking on the word, but it's just to say problems, chaos. You just, whatever causes chaos to arise necessarily in the mind of the individual or out within the external world, it seems that understanding the interplay of the elements involved in that allows one to figure out what they need to fit into the system to deplete the chaos or just bring stability and order. It seems like bringing stability and order is a simple bringing stability and order out of a chaotic expression seems to be a simple process of adding or subtracting the right things. One being able to see what to add and subtract is not as easy as it seems, but it seems that even when one's dealing with just what is not there, being able to see what's not currently in front of me, it seems to be a very general sort of pattern, and paying attention to these general patterns will keep us from saying silly things such as scientists and mathematicians aren't imaginative, and art is the only type of imagination or casting of human imagination. And I'm not saying artists aren't imaginative people, but to me it's just really silly because people are people first and foremost, and what any fool can do, another fool can. So yeah. Anyways, that's my video, and thank you for watching.